Thanks a million, and it's great to be here. And particularly thanks, David, for talking about 30 years ago. That was really helpful. Meaning that our experiences in applied masochism, being token Catholics in a studio, it was really fun, guys. I can't describe how much fun it was to have the presenter and 4 other people in the studio all hating you. Yeah, that was amazing. So we have real life Gen Z people to actually talk to us about the wonderful inputs that we've had all day, where we've been looking at it from maybe a slight distance. And so I have PJ Cronin, and PJ is from Cork and has studied classics and has a passion for literature. He works some of the time in the Mater Dei Classical School there in Cork, which is a privately organised Catholic school. He's been still very involved in things like Bible study and formation for young men. I have Leo here, who's still in UCD? Yeah. Has been chair of the Newman Society. It's interesting that both PJ and Leo share a characteristic that was mentioned several times during the day of, chaplaincies and universities being very important places of formation. And Leo's been involved with Focus Missionaries and has also been involved with Bible studies and so on. And then we have Paula, who I have to thank from the bottom of my heart, because she stepped in literally with half an hour's notice because one of our panelists couldn't make it, and that is generous in the extreme, and I think you should give her a round of applause. And by the grace of God and His Holy Mother, Paula is a unicorn. You know what a unicorn is? It's not a sexual preference. It's something exceedingly rare. So what we've been talking about, and we can see, if we have eyes to see, to look around, the fact that this quiet revival is happening to a large extent among men. And in Paula's case, she was a long time away from her faith, and would have held views that some of which were at odds with the Catholic faith. And due to a number of experiences, which I think she's going to share some of them with us as we go on, has actually come back to her faith and her belief. She now works with an Irish charity. She's involved with the Legion of Mary. She's gone from here down to the Regina Coeli Hospital, which some of you will know. She's involved in a young adult group in Rathmines, so has an awful lot to share with us. So I'm going to start with a really, really important question, which is, guys, is it Gen Z or Gen Z?
I would say Gen Z would be what I'm more accustomed to hearing, definitely. I wouldn't have heard Gen Z much, actually. Probably the first time was when I heard Gen Z.
So having settled that really vital question, your answer to this had better begin with yes, because or else we wasted the entire day. But I just wanted to ask you, how real is this cohort theory? The idea of Gen Z, millennials, and so on. Do you see a difference between yourselves and people who are a little bit older, or people who are a little bit younger? And I'm going to ask all of you, if you do feel that there are differences, to pick out one significant difference. And if the person before you takes what you were going to say, just think fast, okay? Right, Paula, maybe you might start first. How the Gen Z thing, do you think it's real, and what one characteristic of that generation?
Yeah, so I actually asked somebody earlier, what is Gen Z? I'm not actually sure. So when it comes to the age divide, I'm not sure it is, and I'm 35, so I think I'm technically a millennial.
No, you're just
millennial. Yeah. But I suppose something just from my own perspective is we kind of came up with the age just as kind of just after kind of phones were coming in, the real kind of technological age. So I feel like people in my age group are kind of in the middle, where that we're not old enough to say, well, that's, I didn't have any of that when I was growing up, but we're not young enough to have grown up in that environment. So I think there's something kind of technological literacy even, that there's something that we're maybe lacking a little bit.
Okay. So on the older end of Gen Z, it's not all about the technology and the digital. Now, on the younger end of Gen Z, What would you think are the differences?
Well, I would think the opportunities, like now the world becomes a small place for us to traveling through technology, like just everything is accessible on our fingertips. There'll be opportunity would be for me.
Okay, fair enough. Would you?
Yeah, I suppose definitely the world has become a smaller place in some sense, just finding what Leo said. Like, I can remember growing up and friends who were from the heart of Cork City had an American accent because they're watching YouTube and they're being raised by YouTube. And like, I mean, any school you went to today, most of the children probably have half an American accent. Like, that's what's happening. And I think the rise of media, when you talk about Gen Z, is just inextricable from the whole situation. The influence of media, for better or for worse, which we probably will talk about more.
Yes.
But I think, yes, the main factor has to be media and the rise of media as an influence of people as they grow up.
So I'm going to channel my inner Stephen Bullivant now and talk about some of the darker news, in a sense, about Gen Z before we get into the Catholic end of it at all. You hear a lot about Gen Z suffering from anxiety. There's really increased levels of anxiety, of depression. You hear things like that they're the first generation that are not likely to do better financially than their parents. They're owning a home is so much more out of reach. You have the whole gig economy, where the permanent and pensionable job is just kind of evaporated, to a large extent. Would you resonate with any of that? And would you think what impact do you think that has had?
In terms of the economic situation?
Yes, yeah.
There's no doubt, like, I suppose there's a lacking of hope, I would say. And even in my own situation, I came to the faith actually after I finished school. I started to think a lot deeper about life. But I think there is a hopelessness in the sense that, we've been fed this narrative that our life is there is no meaning, or, deconstruction of meaning systems. And then you don't think too much into the future. You only think about your immediate circumstances of where you are in the moment with, relationships or people around you. So, and of course, on top of it, then you have the gloom of the housing crises and all that, and then of course marriage, which I presume we're going to talk about, and fertility rates decreasing, where we're supposed to be in an age where it's all about the satiation of your immediate desires constantly. Everything is about satiation of your desires. Yet we've never been more depressed, isolated, anxious. Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Do either of you want to hop in on that in terms of that kind of feeling for Gen Z of, that there isn't as much hope or as much meaning as there might have been for previous generations, or as clear a path?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of hope, and also purpose in life. I think that's one of the main reasons why anxiety and depression is such a prevalent thing amongst young people. But then at the same time, I still think, back to the point where I said about opportunity, I think from the economic perspective, as we mentioned at the start, I think there's massive opportunity for people to find a purpose in their lives. Like we talked about the media aspect of how you can discover your faith through media. So I think, it's finding that purpose and hope.
Okay, great. So, obviously, one of the things that we hope that Catholicism can offer people is a sense of meaning and a sense of hope. And maybe, Paula, you'd like to share something of your journey with us, of how you came back to your faith, or what it was that pulled you back, and maybe some of your experiences prior to that.
Sure, yeah. So I suppose I grew up in a typical Irish Catholic family where we'd go to Mass at the weekend, but there wasn't really any faith really within the home. It was just kind of what you did. And I moved abroad when I was 20, and I moved to Asia, where I lived for 11 years. And I suppose while I was abroad, I also thought, especially in Asian countries, I was like, oh, I'm a Buddhist. And I started, getting involved in that and did a lot of kind of meditation and stuff. but still was just very kind of, I suppose, never really had any sense of peace. But I suppose a few years ago when I was living in China, I was actually, I suppose God gave me the grace that I actually had an encounter, and so a moment in my life where I instantly knew that God existed, but I didn't know what that would look like or what that meant. And then I moved back to Ireland in 2022, and it's kind of been the last few years then that journey that brought me back to the faith. I suppose I was a feminist for a long time, and I would have been pro-abortion for a long time. And even though I wasn't living in Ireland at the time of the repeal campaign, I would have done a lot of activism around that as well, and have like personal experience with abortion. And so I suppose then when the seed of faith was planted, it was kind of just determining what that would look like. I know that God exists, but I don't know how that would manifest. So I started going back to Mass, but then I also thought, well, I'm not really a Catholic, so I started going to like a non-denominational church as well. But there was something, and there's something that really kind of draws you in there as well, because especially going back to Mass, it's hard it can be hard to come back there, particularly. And this is the thing, if you didn't grow up in the faith at all, like it can be hard to because you don't maybe necessarily understand why you're doing what you're doing. And there's something that's appealing about the non-denominational side, where it's like, oh, everyone gets a coffee and it's way more casual, and they're singing and this kind of stuff. But for me, I suppose when I what really changed for me was when I went back to confession, and that's that really changed things for me. So I suppose I'm thinking in terms of from the side in terms of communicating that with others. Then even you talk about mental health, we talk about mental health, and it's such a prevalent conversation now. And everyone's talking about their mental health and everyone's going to therapy, but it's like if you talk about confession and the actual benefits of that in terms of like how maybe the therapeutic method could draw from confession, I think that's the real kind of tangible impact of that. And things as well, I suppose I've gone to like I love music and art, and I went, a few months ago I went to this like Christian hip hop event, and it was really interesting because you've got like these guys from Dublin who are over from the UK, and they've been in gangs and they've been drug dealers and they've been in jail, but they're up there and they're talking about how Jesus has saved their lives, and you've got these like young teenagers from Ireland who are like cheering them on. But in the Catholic faith, we don't really see things like that. And when it comes to culture, it's like we maybe have a trad night, and that's great, and that's really important, and that's a beautiful part of our culture. But we're definitely missing that kind of element of actually being able to communicate specifically to the people who maybe didn't grow up in that environment, or I don't know about that. So so I think there's that kind of cultural element to it as well.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. We really appreciate that. If I could just, I'm going to come back very much to the whole gender question in a minute, but if I could put the two lads on the spot for a moment. It does seem that there is very much an attraction for young men in Catholicism. And what do you put that down to? And how do you see it happening? Maybe Leo, you'd start this, please. Sorry, I'm being instructed by my husband that you're to raise the microphone.
Sorry.
There's gender freedom.
I suppose it's partly a response to the culture today. Like we're recognizing that just the way things are, it's not, as we went back to purpose and hope and fulfillment, like the woke culture today. It's self-destructive. And I think young people young men are realizing that. I was listening in preparation for this on the way up in the car. I was trying to think of a few points, particularly on the young men issue. I was listening to Bishop Barron, and he was saying that particularly young men need something hard in their lives to give them this purpose. And the woke culture of today is simply not that. It's lovey-dovey, like happy-clappy, and it's young men are turning away from that and then looking towards faith to give them that purpose and something to work towards and a drive in their lives.
And so that's chiming very much with one of the trends that Father Connor was talking about, the whole, and from the audience as well, about the whole kind of stoic thing, the self-improvement thing. Would you chime with that? Would you think that that's a fact? And can you see any downside to that, Peter?
Yeah, I think it's definitely happening. Like there's there's wonderful articles I read on the rise of neo-asceticism, and I can't remember the name of the Twitter founder. Is it Jack Dempsey or Dorsey? I can't remember. Dorsey. And he's this person who will go on like 3-week, 1 carrot a day fast. Like just the craziest things you'd hear of like desert fathers doing, But the problem is what it's serving. So his whole thing is that he's gaining power from this asceticism, and he's using it to serve a purpose that is not the highest good. He's detaching himself from humanity and looking at it from a distance and kind of using his systems to play on others when he steps back from them. Like, these people who are leading these systems would not have their children on Twitter, would not have they're stepping back from themselves. And then just touching back into kind of the ascetic practices that are happening. I think men, a lot of their response, and I see this on campuses a lot, where the kind of woke agenda is being pushed. And the men, straight away, the men with more conservative views, because they're coming in gas shorts, and they're coming in a tracksuit pants, and straight away what their views are. Like me and George talked about this bit on the way up, because it's almost their response to, this hyper woke stuff is just like a complete rejection altogether. And they're kind of rejecting it into a kind of boyhood, where they'll just distract themselves, they'll go to the bookies, they'll go out and, just reject responsibility. And then it's just kind of, as I said, a satiation of whatever their desires are. They're detaching from whatever. And then you have these people who are rising and telling them, like, no, you're supposed to be more than that. Like the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson, who's telling people to clean their room. And, the whole world is going crazy for him. Because he's just saying, no, your life is more than this, it matters. So you have so many people moving in that direction. You mentioned already that, I was leading a Bible study. And I invite everyone to the Bible study, and I try not to make it a weird kind of Christian thing, like, oh, come on, and Jesus will save you, or whatever. Like, the Bible is fundamental to understand history. You should come along and, just conversations like that. And it's always a challenge. It's always a massive challenge. And then last year, I found that it was actually George, a friend who was here, was constantly pestering me about running a marathon. And he was saying, you can't do it. And eventually we just stupidly just said yes and committed. And within the space of a week, there was probably 25 men straight away who came to me and said, I want to do that. And I was thinking, I have been struggling, fighting for weeks trying to get one man into my Bible study, and a marathon, and 25 people sign up. And it's the challenge, it's the strangeness of the cross that actually calls to us. And then, if we present, see, you talked about the scandal of the cross. There's something about that scandal that really appeals to us. And Father, you talked about Tom Holland, just to touch back into the kind of asceticism, the stoicism. Tom Holland talked about how the Stoics in Greece were one of the most fervent people when they converted to Christianity, one of the most receptive people to Christianity. And just to wrap it up, I've been absolutely obsessed with church fathers over the last year and a bit. I've been reading the West and the East. And there's this kind of prominence in the East of a threefold division of the spiritual journey. And the first one is asceticism, they call it praktike. And the next one is natural contemplation, which is physike. And the last one is contemplation of the divine, theologike. And it's this system that has to happen. And I see it happening in young men. I found it in my own journey where you have to detach. There has to be some sort of ascetic practice. There has to be some sort of detachment from the world you're in. And then you start to see truths. You start to see, patterns of being, that there is truths, that, people are being guided by certain things or whatever. And then you start to come to the source of reality itself. What is truth nested in? Truth is nested in something permanent, something fixed, something that's not, flowing and changing constantly. It's nested in eternity, in God Himself, with truth, goodness, and beauty. And I think, in just that small movement towards asceticism initially is at the beginning of that. It's that cross that's not being explicitly presented to someone, but that challenge of where meaning will be found. And I think that's where then the church has to present the cross. Because we've talked about, how it can be slightly watered down and constantly watered down. And the problem is, it is the cross that's actually attracting people who are so fervent and want to live that out. And it's then people who are, like a Trump or a Andrew Tate, who are standing firmly against this stuff with a backbone, that are attracting men who are looking for something. And we can shy away from that, from presenting that truth. Whereas if we present the fullness of the cross, the fullness of what it means to be a man and a woman, and anyone, I think, will be achieved in that. And then the ascetic practices, instead of going towards, all these Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and all these, just people leading society in the wrong directions, can be brought into building a church and a better community.
Thank you, that was absolutely terrific. And it seems to me to be something that's really strong and really real. And now I'm going to channel my inner Father Connor and just be a Debbie Downer and talk about the risks that are involved with that. Because something that I have noticed with some of the young men who have come back to the faith, and we're very, very glad to have them, is that there can be a channel through a particular type of conservatism that draws them in. And what you're saying, PJ, is really beautiful, because it's kind of an entry step, and then you're bringing them into the fullness of Catholicism and the fullness of the challenge of Christ and so on. But because they may not have been, they may not have much in terms of formation or catechesis or whatever, they're mistaking aspects of conservatism for Catholicism, and sometimes dragging quite negative stereotypes with them into Catholicism. And I don't know, I'm going to come to Leo first and then to Paula for a woman's perspective on that. But I don't know if you're aware of that, Leo, or if you think that there's anything can be done about that, or have you witnessed it yourself?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think it's definitely an issue. But I know for me personally, and in UCD and in UCC, we've been very lucky to have the Focus missionaries, who did Focus stands for Fellowship of Catholic University Students, and so Focus is an American organisation that's expanded out to Europe in the last 4 or 5 years, and normally it's students who just graduated from university, and they commit 2 years to missionary work on university campuses. So in UCD last year we had 4 missionaries. This year we've lost one, so there are 3 missionaries.
Jesus.
Well, exactly. But they do active work in terms of leading Bible studies, and then what they call also discipleship. I know that we talk about it more of a Protestant element to it. They're very staunch Catholic, very good, excellent formation.
And you think that helps with the gender stereotyping thing, that there's a healthy vision there of male-female relationships?
I think so. I think what I was getting to was that they teach you what a Catholic stereotype, what it means to be Catholic.
Right.
And they make that clear, and there's no massive this ultra conservative influence. They're clear and they do it very well.
Great. And Paula, what about
Could you identify with anything that I was saying there, and could you also comment a little bit on the barriers that there are for a lot of women in terms of their faith? We're in a situation which is, I think, a first in history, where it's actually easier for a young man to come back to his faith than women, because the church has relied on women as the backbone for, I think, practically its entire history. So this is a very unusual cultural phenomenon. So what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I suppose I think women are, just by their very nature, tend to be more kind of, I suppose, less conservative and more kind of empathetic. And I think that's what's easier maybe with the kind of culture that we have, in terms of we have to be kind and we have to be tolerant, so-called. So, women are maybe more able to, or so are more inclined to kind of follow this kind of ideology. and less able to kind of turn towards conservatism. But I suppose when it comes to kind of what's the challenges then for women, I suppose particularly for women who haven't grown up in the faith or have lived a life very far from God, and I think even within our bodies, and that's what Father Connor brought up in his talk as well, in terms of that women, are the ones who take the hormonal contraception, and women are the ones who have the abortions, and even when it comes to sexual exploitation, women are the ones who are exploited, and they are the ones who are objectified. And that's not to say that men aren't affected by that as well. Of course they are, but I suppose it's more maybe physical for women who actually physically go through those things. And I suppose even the organisation that I work with, we work with women who are impacted by prostitution and human trafficking, and that's overwhelmingly an issue that affects women, and it's men who buy women. And even though I wouldn't identify as a feminist anymore, this is a very real issue as well. That's something that is important to consider. And I suppose even from my own background, when I was a feminist, I was also very anti-contraception, but not from a moral or ethical perspective, but from a woman's health perspective, because knowing, and I've done a lot of research in terms of the impact of the pill and the IUDs and all the other types of contraception cause to women's bodies. Then obviously since I've come back to my faith, I understand that from a moral and ethical perspective. Then it's even things about learning about, theology of the body, and now that I'm trained in fertility awareness method, and I'm training in a natural family, teaching natural family planning, and this is, really, I suppose, tangible stuff for women and men and for couples to understand. And I suppose that's something that I think in terms of the challenge is how do we communicate that, and should we, and I'd love to hear people's perspective on this as well, and I've talked to a few people about this already, but should we lead with Jesus first? I think that's what PJ was saying as well, that you don't want to just kind of go in and Jesus is going to save your life. No, he will, but if you kind of lead with that, you're turning people off almost straight away. But also there has to, but should we try and kind of secularize the teachings of, say, theology of the body or something else to bring that to people, or should, do we lead with Jesus first? I don't know, that's an interesting way.
It's definitely something that we can come back to and talk about in a minute or two, because it is a big issue. Have you thoughts on how we can reach out better to young women? What kind of language are women, for men it seems to be very much the language of challenge, and they want to run a marathon more than they want to do a Bible study, and we don't want to get into narrow gender stereotyping, because there are plenty of women who would be kind of enthused about running a marathon. I just have never been one of those women. But have you thoughts about how the church can actually reach out to women?
Yeah, I suppose it's a question that I have, and I suppose an important thing is leading with friendship, with developing friendships first. And I think that really, when you build a relationship with somebody, say me, if I build a relationship with people who don't have any faith and they get to know me as a person, I suppose that the fact that I can really relate to people who don't have any belief in God, because I was there for so long myself. So it's building the friendships first, and then maybe kind of leading through those friendships. But yeah, I think it's also understanding the women's perspective in terms of, a woman who, and this is the thing as if she's been taking contraception for, most of her life, which so many women have. I mean, that affects their brain in general. So I suppose it's understanding the kind of the influences that are leading women to behave like that, but also understanding the perspective of why they're choosing to live in this way as well. So just having that kind of understanding of what they're going through.
Yeah, and interestingly, the whole focus method is friendship first, isn't it? It's the idea that, by having peer-to-peer relationships. I'm going to come back to the thing of, the church and what the church can be doing. But David Quinn will kill me if I don't ask this question, so I have to ask it, which is, what are the kind of the online or offline influences that are, strongest? What are people watching online? What are they listening to? Is anyone reading a book? As someone who writes for a newspaper, is anyone reading a newspaper? I know the answer to that, under 30s. But just what are, I'm talking about for your generation in general, not just Catholics, and we'll come back to then to what are the really strong influences in terms of Catholics. If any of you'd like to, PJ, have any thoughts? Or, yeah?
Yes, yeah, so what influences are most prominent, you would say? Is it?
Yes, for Gen Z in general.
Okay.
In general.
Oh, in general rather than the Catholic. Okay.
They're actually
well, maybe I'm not the best person to ask because I feel like I've stepped back from that. Yeah, no, I suppose the Catholic perspective is one I'm more embedded in. But I suppose before that, I think Joe Rogan, some of you can't ignore, just absolutely monumental to, I suppose, again, probably preaching to the masculine crowd more with Joe Rogan. I know less about the more feminine side. Joe Rogan, David Goggins, Andrew Huberman, kind of secular side. I think, well, you mentioned the podcast, I can't remember the name of it. Yeah, it's kind of a lot of self-development and, be a better you, maybe sometimes very egocentric rather than theocentric. But it can point further, like Joe Rogan, who would have Jordan Peterson's on his podcast, who would have Bishop Barron is on his podcast, and then it's like a stream that can flow that way. Yeah.
I think one thing that's an aspect of Gen Z is this short form of information, the likes of YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, TikTok, and I think that leads to such a broad range. So a lot of it you describe as brain rot, but there's ultimately like you do get your feeds is according to what your algorithm gives you and what you like, and it picks up on what you like. So I think it picks up on what you like and maybe even pushes you to certain extremes. So that's.
I think that's actually a really important point for old people like me to realise is the kind of algorithmic bubble that there is now, that people are pushed into narrower and narrower things, and unfortunately some of them are very negative. But if you're interested in Get Ready With Me videos, you'll find 400 of them in your feed, So it's hard to say that there's one thing that is influencing a generation, and that in itself is interesting because it's different. It's very different. Paul, have you any thoughts on?
So I suppose when it comes to those kind of self-improvement, those kind of modern podcasts, I don't see an awful lot of that are aimed towards women. And I used to listen a lot to Modern Wisdom, and I would still listen to Joe Rogan now. And I also really enjoyed Jordan Peterson, and I learned an awful lot from him. But I think maybe that's unique to me, and that's not typical, I think, for a lot of women. But I suppose there's, as David mentioned earlier, there's Louise Perry. She's kind of an alternative voice now as well, and Mary Harrington. But I think for women, a lot of what they're looking towards is it's like the Kardashians, and they're also maybe looking at like beauty, the influencers. Those are the kind of things that maybe young women are gravitating towards. As well as kind of things that are like overtly, sexualizing them, and it's feminism, and it's this kind of, this kind of incessant, culture that's pushing, increasing the divide between men and women as well. So
I suppose something that I would have been very concerned about when I was teaching was that the whole skinny talk thing for women, which kind of briefly fell out of favour, ironically because of the Kardashians in their not skinny phase, but then kind of came back, and of course witch talk and things like that, which that people trying rituals in their bedroom, and it's like, okay, you don't believe in God, but you're willing to kind of curse your teacher who gave you too much homework, okay. And then in terms of the area you're very comfortable in, PJ, Catholic influencers.
I suppose Catholic influencers, I suppose you're bringing it back to, a personal experience. I know there is the Mike Schmitz, his father said the Golden Retriever. Never really appealed too much to me. I think it's an Irishness actually, where you kind of, that bubbly and, there's something about that.
You're just grumpy.
Yeah, I think maybe I am just grumpy, but Bishop Barron was a massive influence on me. I think the biggest influence was probably Jonathan Pageau, if anybody knows him. Yeah, a few heads nodding. I think he was just absolutely massive for me. someone who just brings a completely biblical worldview centered on kind of church fathers and on tradition, and shows you a whole new way of seeing the world. That just because I think it takes a long time to break down that kind of secular worldview that you've been given, that individualistic kind of stuff where everything's centered on yourself or on self-actualization, all that type of stuff. So he was massive, and outside that, maybe, I know it's not explicitly Catholic, but Tom Holland, massive influence. And I think all of those Catholic kind of sources actually point to books, which for me is massive. I think all of them, they're constantly just citing books and references, and then in a way as well that it presents them with such beauty. You know, they talk about historians who've written on these topics that are amazing, or philosophers or church fathers, as I've said, have gone down that rabbit hole. So I think it's great that they kind of bring you to a more participative form of knowledge in actually reading and then studying and stuff like that. So